Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
I was born a slave, but I didn't know it until I was 6 years old. I had a happy childhood. My father was a carpenter. He was very smart and good at his job. When special buildings were made, people called him to be the head worker. He had to pay his mistress $200 every year, and he could keep the rest of his money. He was allowed to work and manage his own life. His biggest wish was to buy his children's freedom, but even though he offered his hard-earned money many times, he couldn't succeed. My parents had light brown skin. People called them mulattoes. They lived in a nice home, and even though we were slaves, I was protected with so much love. I didn't know that I was something that could be sold. I had one brother, William, who was 2 years younger than me. He was a bright and loving child. I also had my grandmother, who was very special in many ways. My grandmother was the daughter of a farmer in South Carolina. When he died, he gave my grandmother's mother and her 3 children freedom, along with some money to go to St. Augustine, where they had family. This was during the Revolutionary War, and they were caught on their way. They were taken back and sold to different people. This is the story my grandmother told me, but I don't remember all the details. She was a little girl when she was captured and sold to the owner of a big hotel. She often told me how hard her childhood was. But as she grew up, she became very smart and loyal. Her master and mistress knew she was important and valuable. She worked in many jobs in the house, like cooking, taking care of babies, and sewing clothes. She was praised for her cooking, and her crackers were so famous in the area that many people wanted them. Because so many people asked for her crackers, she asked her mistress for permission to bake at night after finishing all the housework. Her mistress allowed it, but she had to use the money to buy clothes for herself and her children. So, after working all day for her mistress, she baked crackers at night, helped by her 2 oldest children. The business made money, and each year she saved a little. She hoped to buy her children's freedom with that money. But her master died, and his property was given to his children. The widow, who was the master's wife, kept the hotel open. My grandmother stayed as a slave, but her children were given to different members of the family. Since she had 5 children, the youngest, Benjamin, was sold so that each family member could get an equal share of money. Benjamin and I were almost the same age, so he felt more like my brother than my uncle. He was a bright, handsome boy, almost white in skin color because of my grandmother's European ancestors. Even though he was only 10 years old, someone paid $720 for him. His sale was a terrible pain for my grandmother, but she kept hoping. She worked hard, believing she could buy her children one day. She had saved $300, but one day her mistress asked to borrow the money, promising to pay her back soon. Slaves were not allowed to have legal rights, so no promise to a slave was considered valid. When my grandmother lent her money, she had to trust the honor of her mistress. But can a slaveholder be trusted by a slave? I owed many good things in my life to my grandmother. My brother Willie and I often got some of the crackers, cakes, and jams she made to sell. And after we grew up, she helped us in even bigger ways. My early childhood was very lucky. When I was 6 years old, my mother died. For the first time, I heard people talking and learned that I was a slave. My mother's mistress was the daughter of my grandmother's mistress. My mother and her mistress were like sisters because they were both fed by my grandmother when they were babies. In fact, my mother stopped drinking her mother's milk when she was 3 months old, so her mistress could get enough milk. They grew up together as children, and when they became women, my mother was a very faithful servant to her whiter foster sister. On her deathbed, her mistress promised that my mother's children would never suffer. And while she was alive, she kept her promise. They all spoke kindly about my mother after she died. Even though she was a slave, she was noble and had a good heart. I cried for her, and I worried about who would take care of me and my little brother now. They told me that I would live with my mother's mistress, and I found it to be a happy home. I didn't have to do hard or unpleasant jobs. My mistress was very kind to me. I was always happy to do what she asked, and I was proud to work for her as much as I could at my young age. I would sit with her for hours, sewing carefully, with a heart as happy and free as any white child born free. When she thought I was tired, she would send me outside to run and play. I would jump around and gather berries or flowers to put in her room. Those were very happy days, too happy to last. A slave child does not think about the future, but bad things always come to people who are born to be slaves. When I was almost 12 years old, my kind mistress got sick and died. I watched as her face became pale and her eyes dull. I prayed in my heart that she would live because I loved her. She was almost like a mother to me, but my prayers were not answered. She died, and they buried her in the little churchyard. Every day I went there, and my tears fell on her grave. I was sent to stay with my grandmother for a week. I was now old enough to think about the future. Again and again, I asked myself what would happen to me. I was sure that I would never find another mistress as kind as the one who had just died. She had promised my dying mother that her children would never suffer. When I remembered that and thought about how much she had cared for me, I hoped she had given me my freedom. My friends were sure that she had. They believed she would do it because of my mother's love and faithful service. But sadly, we all know that the love and loyalty of a slave do not mean much when it comes to saving her children from being sold. After a short time of waiting, the will of my mistress was read. We learned that she had given me to her sister's daughter, who was only 5 years old. So, our hopes disappeared. My mistress had taught me, you should love your neighbor as yourself and do to others what you would like them to do to you. But I was her slave, and I guess she did not see me as her neighbor. I wish I could erase this one big wrong from my memory. As a child, I loved my mistress. When I look back on the happy days I spent with her, I try to feel less angry about this unfair thing she did. While I lived with her, she taught me how to read and spell. Slaves were rarely given this chance, so I am thankful for that. She did not have many slaves. When she died, all her slaves were given to her family members. 5 of those slaves were my grandmother's children, and they had drunk the same milk as her own children. Even though my grandmother worked faithfully for her owners for a long time, none of her children were saved from being sold at the auction. These living, breathing people were treated no better than the cotton they planted or the horses they took care of.